Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV, and I have the honor tonight again of talking with Dr. Kameelah Rashad. I just so enjoy talking with her. I could do a week just with her because she does so many things. But let me tell you a little bit about her. We're talking tonight about Black psychology and the Freedom Dreams intensive that I just finished with her and loved, uh, and some other things perhaps. Dr. Rashad is a visiting assistant professor of psychology and Muslim studies at Chicago Theological Seminary. She is also the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. Oh, she has previously served as a the Muslim chaplain at the University of Pennsylvania, and she also works as the founder, if I'm not mistaken, of the Muslim Wellness Group. It is my honor and pleasure to finally have chased you down and to have you on here with me so we can discuss these issues. There's so many issues that I could discuss. Let's talk about um, the need for Black Muslim psychology.
Well, walaikum salam. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And I'm gonna start calling you Mama Amina
Ah,
because you certainly get me every time.
every time.
Um, well, the need, or really, I think Black Muslims are deserving of a space that is carved out intentionally and purposefully for us to really be able to process, right, the past, the present, the future, this specific context, especially related to those of us who are descendant of enslaved Africans, both in the US and the Caribbean, to really get an understanding of all of the context, the history, the challenges, the opportunities that we have faced, and how we have what we have done, right, in the context of all of that to fashion a life, right, an identity, a spiritual practice, racial pride in the midst of all of that. And it means that we need this affinity space, right, to really discuss what we've done, what we're doing well, and what the future looks like for us if we are to live in a community in which we feel whole, everyone feels like they belong and that they matter. And these are some of the things that we discussed in the Black Muslim Psychology Intensive, right? The concept of belonging and mattering, and how critical that is for us to experience healing in the United States and also within our various communities.
Well, let's take a little bit of that apart. Much of the literature on healing, um, coming to terms with abuse, etc.,
Mhm.
is white literature.
Mhm.
How are Black especially Black Muslim psychologists, adapting, or are they redoing the whole thing to get together text or references for us who don't quite have the same issues, or we don't look at the issues the same way?
Absolutely. I think, by given the nature of who we are, the work of, you know, defining a Black Muslim psychology, which I would explain is not simply about mental health, right? It is about the formation of identity, collective well-being, spiritual practice, as a holistic practice, like mind, body, and soul. Again, within the context, grounded in who we are, where we are, and how we have been impacted by all of the events, like past, present, and those events to come. And so by virtue of who we are and where we are, this framework of Black Muslim psychology is interdisciplinary, right? It's looking at who are those historians, religious scholars, psychologists, theologians, um, educators, right? All of those members of our communities that can contribute an understanding and a perspective that allows us to see ourselves in, as complex, as nuanced, as multi-layered, and all of those factors contribute to how we think about ourselves, right? The thoughts, the beliefs, the biases that we have, and also, paying attention to the ways that we've also internalized oppression, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and what that has done to us, how that internalization has manifested in our lives and the ways that we build community. But that hasn't been sort of the only factor which has defined who we are, because in the midst of that, we've also been very purposeful and diligent about fashioning and sort of shaping a life that is not simply defined by trauma and oppression, but also about hope and joy and faith. And so that sort of coming together and understanding and really articulating a Black Muslim psychology pays attention to history, context, um, also joy and celebration, and being able to then express um, an understanding of who we are that is not solely defined by what we've endured.
Yeah, I can see that, and why there's a need for I don't want to say a special place. I would say an additional space
Yes.
for us to think about this. I'm thinking of today, I think they talk about this boy who went to Kenosha with his AK something or the other
Kyle
rifle
Rittenhouse.
to shoot people, but also Arbery, the young man that was shot because he was jogging down the street. And
Hmm.
the judges in these trials are both buffoons. So it's hard to see things changing,
Right.
and that becomes another layer of trauma as you watch and you wait and try not to watch and you wait some more
Right.
for something to happen. So in this intensive, and I'm gonna weave in and out here a little bit,
Okay.
I signed up for this intensive because, oh my gosh, it was an opportunity to be with younger than I'm Muslims. And then number two, it was something I hadn't really thought about,
Mm.
participated in, but hadn't thought about, and that's these freedom dreams.
Yes.
The thing that unnerved me, and I hope you do it again, was it should have been 300 people clamoring at the door to get into the intensive. And it was an opportunity for intergenerational conversation.
Hmm.
Um, but tell me a little bit. I got Robin Kelly's book.
Oh, excellent.
Well, I'm a good student.
Yes, you are.
Um, and I'm appreciating he was bringing back to mind all of the things that provided the energy that moved Black people through generations. But I want you to tell the audience why was this intensive labeled Freedom Dreams?
So, what we decided to do for the 2021 Black Muslim Psychology Conference is this the conference intensive, right? And so that responds to the question of whether or not it's safe to gather, and we determined it wasn't.
Mhm.
But we still wanted to have these conversations and not sort of condense so much of what we wanted to discuss into a weekend, right? So we
Okay.
wanted to extend this over 10 weeks. And the central question was, as we begin to think about our theme, which is Black Muslim freedom dreams, taking a journey beyond. So, beyond where we are now, right? Thinking about the pandemic of COVID-19, sort of a renewed sort of attention to racial violence, although that violence had been present, right, throughout our history. The rise of white Christian nationalism. So there's all of these factors that I think challenge us to think about what kind of community do we want to be, right? Where do we want to imagine ourselves, say, in the next 20 years, right? So the question that we posed in this intensive was, imagine it's the year 2041, right? And you're a member of a community in which you're thriving, you feel loved, you feel like you belong and you're respected. What do you love about this community? How did you get there, right? And what keeps you there? And what are you most proud of? And so, in order to explore sort of that question of imagination, we had to consider, what does it mean to build community, right, in the midst of oppression and circumstances that honestly can lead to despair. But if we take an approach and we use this framework called appreciative inquiry, um, to sort of guide how we thought about tackling this question, and it is to pay attention to, what have we done well, right? What is the best of what is, and how can we do more of that in order to build this future in which we see ourselves as whole and thriving and healing. And so that required, right, this 10-week process of delving deeper into, what does community mean, what does freedom mean, what does liberation mean, how are we defining those really big terms, and how are we defining them in relationship to one another, and how we conceptualize what it means to be a part of a healthy community.
Well, of course, I'm going to delve into. So, this was the only intensive I've been in when everybody was saying, I can't wait for Tuesday night to come. And I got to get there. And, we're putting off other things. And no, it's Tuesday night. You can't get anything else out of me because
Yes.
it's Tuesday night.
Yes.
So I'm going to take a quick break for a moment. You're welcome to have some tea or coffee or water, and we'll be right back. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen on Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV, and I'm having a wonderful conversation with Dr. Kameelah Rashad on Black psychology and freedom dreams. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk with Muslim Network TV, and I'm in the midst of a wonderful conversation with Dr. Kameelah Rashad on Black psychology and freedom dreams. Now, you mentioned some things. There were, of course, well, no, that's not true. Every week it was great. So let me just choose and
Okay.
say, one of the mm, I can't even choose one. Let me say, why don't you choose three? Because it was
Uh-oh.
belonging, it was feeling included in a community, it
Yes.
was being respected for whatever you brought to that community. There were issues with women in leadership. There were just so many things. I was never so excited for Tuesday.
Well, part of Well, I'll explain a little bit more about appreciative inquiry and the reason that we chose to use that framework from, a positive psychology strength-based model that really looks at, and instead of defining or using a problem-based sort of deficit approach, right? And typically that question sounds like, "What's wrong with the community? How can we fix it?" Right? So we've all heard that before. Unfortunately, the drawback to using that kind of approach is that it focuses our attention on the deficit. It limits our imagination, right? Because we can become overwhelmed by just the number of issues and problems that communities are facing, and instead, it says, how do we appreciate the best of what is? Right? This is not ignoring what's problematic, but saying, how do we understand what we're doing well? Right? And the underlying assumption of that question is that we're doing something well, right? That there are strengths, there are gifts, there are talents within our community that if we can identify, if we can lift them up, if we can highlight them, and then do more of that, right? How can that also help push us forward? So to think of this strength-based sort of resilient approach then pushes us to ask, well, how are we defining a healthy community, right? What is a shared definition that we can use in which to compare, right? What are we doing well? Who's doing it? Who's involved? And so we started with understanding the four elements of sense of community
Yeah.
from Macmillan and Chavis, and that is looking at, what is the emotional connection, right, in that community? How are people feeling that around membership and influence, right? How are they thinking about their sense of belonging within that community? And is that community meeting their needs, right? However they define them, physical needs, emotional needs. And so when we use sort of uh, that four factor approach, one of the questions that it raised was, well, if one of the important elements of community is that people feel like they matter, right? That they
Hmm.
belong, that they have influence, that their contributions are welcomed and applauded. It raised the question about healthy community in relationship to women and children and youth, right?
Right.
And so if you have a significant number of community members who do not feel like their needs are being met, who do not feel that they have influence and that they're valued, can we call it a community? Can we call it a healthy community?
But
Um,
on that point, right along,
yeah.
how is when imams are not asking that question, and there's no space for community members to volunteer and answer, how do we get to uh, that information? I'm thinking about there's some masajid, um, oh, well, they boast. We have 300 members.
Mhm,
Do you know them? I mean, do you have a clue as to what skills are in your community?
mhm,
Have you figured out a rubric which will have appropriate places
right,
to put some of those skills? Don't assign all the women to the kitchen
right,
or to hand out stuff.
right.
What skills are there? How are you going to? What is your suggestion, perhaps, for how communities take their temperature?
One, I would suggest that they do that, right? That they see that being able to do that kind of community needs assessment, but not just needs, but also I would say like a gifts assessment,
Right.
right? That everyone in the community, and these are sort of these presuppositions, right? That we all have to agree that everyone in a community has something of value to contribute,
Okay.
right? Everyone has to believe that and have to demonstrate that not just through word but through deed, right? And
Right.
so in order to assess who's in our community, what gifts and talents would they like to contribute, because people want to, right? That
Mhm.
contributes to a sense of community. um, how do we go about gathering that information? It should simply be, what, we are so appreciative of everything that folks have to offer. We want to know the best way we can leverage those strengths so that we can also demonstrate our appreciation. right? So there's even
No,
a
that's
way.
hmm. That's what I was thinking about. Community there, in some of the immigrant massages, what they do is you sign up and you pay money, but they don't know beyond how much money you pay and what your name is given that money, anything about you. You know, what your skills are, what you think you can bring to the community. So one quick and easy thing would be is to have a sheet. Who are you? What skills do you have to offer?
Mhm. You know, and one of the things that we discuss in the intensive is around boundaries of membership, right? How
Mhm.
do people know that they're actually a member of the community? Do they receive a welcome email, right? Is there is there a call that's made to say, you know, we noticed that you have shown an interest in being a part of this community. Can, you know, can we connect and have a conversation with
Mhm.
you?
Mhm.
What, and even asking what is drawing you to this space, right? How can how can we get to know you better, right? And then once we get to know you better, we can also think about what will be the best sort of role for each person who wants to become a member of that community. Often people don't know. Am I an outsider? Am I an insider? Am I somewhere in between, kind of in limbo, right? Um, but but this is why, excuse me, we talked about intentional community, right? Not community by default, right? Like, well, I go to that masjid because it's the one that's closest to me and I just pray Jummah and that's it. I don't want to have anything to do with anything else.
Mhm. Mhm.
But intentional communities think very deeply and thoughtfully about how to engage membership, right?
Right.
And this is not simply because you want people to contribute money, right?
Right.
You want them to contribute their time and their talents. But if you
That's
don't know what they are, you know, it's almost like having, you know, buried treasure, right, in your own
yeah.
community, and you don't even know where it is, how to look for it, how to unearth it, right?
Yeah.
Because again, um, the underlying assumption has to be everyone has something of value to contribute, right?
Yeah.
Everyone. And so if there is uh, implied in the way that sort of leadership is valued, or the way certain groups, that is usually men, are valued over others,
Mhm.
there will be all of this untapped potential within a community that can really contribute to it thriving and being sustainable, but we may not know what that is, right?
You know, that's interesting because the leadership, whether you're in the African American or the immigrant community, is male.
Hmm.
So, what do you do with all those gifts, that buried treasure, and perhaps expertise in what that leadership thinks it has expertise in? What do you do with it when you jettison off a good number, 50% some places, 60% other places
Hmm.
of your community?
Well, I think there has to be the realization that when the the contributions or the expertise, or the talents of a community is unknown or undervalued,
Mhm.
that is actually counterproductive to your mission, right? So I think it also it requires a shift in what is evaluated and what is um, uh, uh, seen as worthy, right, in a
Mhm.
community. And so the whether it's a leader or like a leadership committee,
Mm.
has to come to an awareness and also an acceptance that one, there's value in every member of the community, right?
Right.
And I have to know what that is so that their participation in this community is actually mutually beneficial, right? We have to value that as
That
well.
would make that would provide so much of a positive atmosphere. And I think people in those last two things you said, belonging, and they thrive,
Mhm,
they do it, but it seems as though we just haven't thought about it. We talked about communities to which you have to take a bayout. Well,
mhm,
that's to the leadership. The
right.
leadership isn't taking one to you. The
Maybe they should.
Maybe they should. In other communities, there are all kinds of borderlines and barriers where you can tell that you don't belong to this community
Mhm.
really by
Right.
language, by memories, perhaps
Mhm.
in some,
Mhm.
you know, um, lots of different ways people can tell you, oh, you're really a member, or
Mhm.
yeah, you're here.
You're a visitor.
So, get on. But I want to go, and I think that inclusiveness and belonging
Mhm.
are two important things, and you said a lot about them.
Yes, yes. So we talked about again, kind of using a lot of what I wanted to do in the intensive was to introduce concepts that are based on within the field of psychology and mental health, but
Hmm.
has application right to how we think about healthy spirituality, how we think about leadership, and also healing, right? Because what another sort of presupposition or assumption that we have to accept is that people do not heal on their own, right? As an individual, we
Yeah,
heal in relationship, we heal in community. And
right.
so if the opportunities for folks to really engage in that process are very limited, right? Then what is that? How does that reduce the potential for them to continue to thrive over their lifespan? Right. And so this is why community is still very critical. I mean, we live in a society that would push us to think very individualistically, right? Like think about what you need to do and what's best for you. But what's best for you is actually what's best for the collective, right?
Mhm.
Generally, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so when we think about how pivotal a role the community plays in the life and in the health of each individual member, we will probably pay more attention to that, right?
Mhm.
And so this idea, one of the concepts that I introduced was the seven principles of belonging, and that's really thinking about one again this idea of membership, right? How do people know that they're in? Um, how do we talk about our origin stories? Right? Like, how did this community form? Who was a part of that?
Yeah.
What was the issue that this community was seeking to address, right, in its formation? Um, what are some of the rituals and sacred spaces that contribute to that community being able to tell its own story? Right, instead of being defined by others, there's really a focus on self-determination and self-definition.
Hmm.
um, and so when we think about the principles of belonging, and how that again, in the absence of intentionality,
Hmm.
right, we will find that there is either just kind of a neglect, right? A benign neglect. There's an erasure. There's the inability to actually continue to imagine that community in the future, right? What would be the mechanism by which that community would be able to continue, right? If there's no origin story, there are no rituals,
Right, right.
there's no definition, right, of who we are. It dissipates, right? It
Yeah.
just kind of dissolves, right? Either organically or it's forced. There's a disruption, right? So in the context of Black Muslim community building, we also have to talk about the external threats that seek to disrupt, right? That effort to be whole, to heal,
Mhm.
to really think about sovereignty and safety, right? How do we create a space for ourselves in which we feel protected and nurtured and valued, right?
Well, that's interesting that you mention the sovereignty because sometimes there are outside forces, but there are also inside forces.
Yes.
As if people don't really want to reveal who they are,
Right.
and thereby they kind of prevent. I mean, you don't have to tell your worst story, but the thing about it is you prevent the best of you from
Yes.
coming in, getting acknowledged and being pushed forward, which may prevent a relapse for you.
Right. Right. And that speaks to again, there's in relational cultural theory, there's this idea of the central relational paradox, right? And what that means is that we all, right, as human beings, We crave being seen and understood, right? We want those relationships in which we feel like there's no facade, right? We can be who we are.
Yeah.
However, we're so afraid of the vulnerability that that requires, right?
Yeah.
We're afraid of being hurt. We're afraid of being taken advantage of and manipulated,
Mhm.
traumatized, perhaps. And so we hide, right? A lot of aspects of who we are out of fear of that potential danger. But what it also does is it walls off, right, the possibilities that we can for us to actually connect, right, authentically and to be seen in the way that we really truly desire. And so in a healthy community, there's especially for Black Muslims, um, there's being mindful of the external threats, right? Whether that is surveillance, that is entrapment, that is um, infiltration, right? All of that, we
Mhm.
know this is not conspiracy theory. This is fact, right? It's what has happened to us.
Okay.
Um, and at the same time, because of the internalization of notions of Black inferiority, of oppression, we have to also be on guard for the ways that we can replicate the structures internally that are damaging us,
Yeah.
right? So that looks like misogyny, that looks like sexism, that looks like colorism, right, within a Black community.
Mhm.
That looks like valuing some over others for based on whatever kind of metric of desirability. Um, and so when we have both the external threats and then the internal strife, right, kind of rubbing, we
Mhm.
have to have very clear ideas and ability to articulate what our vision is, right? What is our purpose? Because it is the purpose and it is the purpose that will allow us to take a step back, right? When people are getting on each other's nerves and then you got, all of the conflict that will inevitably emerge,
Mhm.
what are we striving to do, right? And we talked about in the intensive the Black Muslim freedom dream sort of framework is to think about, what is our destination, right? That is freedom, that is liberation, that is healing.
Mhm.
um, and the route that we wanted to consider, um, in order to reach that destination, is appreciative inquiry, right? Being able to identify those strengths and the resilience and the joy and just the remarkable courage that we have as Black Muslims to create life for ourselves, and to think of ourselves as the guide. Right, so many of the movements that we talked about, part of the external threat was often the threat of Arab hegemony, South Asian hegemony, people telling us that we
Still
were not legitimately
there.
still there, right?
Mhm.
Telling us that we are not authentically Muslim. We don't have a legitimate claim, right, to Islam and to this deen. So we have to see ourselves as the guides we need in order to get us to our destination. And then finally, we talked about our North Star, right? In that journey is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so when we feel lost, we feel disoriented, we feel, the pressure of others who are questioning our ability to be free, right? We turn and we hold on to our faith and relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get us to where we need to go. Um, and within all of that, right, looking at our destination, the route that we're going to take to get there, you know, having pride in our own capacity and competency, right, and ability to get to that destination, and that Allah is always, right, the divine that we look to, in order to say, one, yes, there are going to be internal strife, there's going to be external threats, but we believe in a higher power, right? We believe in a God that's greater than all of that. And so how do we make use of that faith? How do we make use of our own intellectual capacity, right? Our brilliance, in order to carve a path for ourselves that we may not see, right? And I share this with my daughter. I was like, we have to think about planting the seeds of a tree in which we will not sit under its shade,
Oh, yeah.
right? That is how we think about sustaining, right, and building a future. And so in the midst of that, as we create, as we experiment, as we um, think about the joy and the love that we feel in each other's company, all of that is healing, right? It doesn't just look like one thing, but the healing is in our striving together.
I agree. We're going to take another quick break. And I want you to think about one of the things, and oh goodness, I think I've turned it on twice this year. I was listening to Fox News
Uh,
because I wanted to know what was going on about critical race theory and what are parents, school boards saying. And they had a um, piece on there that they did about one particular school board, and I think it was in Ohio, and I'm not remembering everything.
mm,
But one of the things that this white mom said was, I don't want my child to be taught that he is an oppressor. And I don't think other mothers want their children taught that they are victims.
mm,
And some of that kind of belied, she doesn't have a clue as to what American education is or what makes it run, but that's a different issue. The other thing is back to intentional communities.
mhm.
But think about that. How do we form them? Because some of the older
Yeah.
communities are not going to change. They're going to remain as unhealthy as they are, but we want to move.
Wait, now now if we were gonna think in a positive sort of frame of mind, right?
Okay.
It's also
And the positive part of that is moving ahead. This is
absolutely.
Dr. Aminah Al-Deen with Critical Talk, talking with Dr. Kameelah Rashad on Muslim Network TV, and we'll be right back. Hmm. This is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen on Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV, and I have the special honor, of speaking with Dr. Kameelah Rashad, and I am going to make steam come from under that scarf in a minute. I left you with thinking about how we form intentional communities, and I'm keeping all of this positive. You burn a lot of energy trying to change one kind of stone to something that's more pliable, when you could just put your efforts into formation, taking the good, where it lies, but not ramming your head up against a brick wall. I can't hear you.
So this is what I love about appreciative inquiry, right? That it shifts our attention away from, not away from, but it focuses our attention on what we're doing well, right? And so if we think about in a community what we're doing well and who is a part of that effort to make the community better or improved in some way, then that becomes those individuals, right, who make up, who contribute to that effort towards improvement, then become the focus, right? How do we give them more resources? How do we give them more agency, right? How do we step back perhaps so that those who are capable in a particular way can step forward? And so part of when we think about the communities that are existing, right, and we sort of lament how rigid or constrained they might be, how they're perhaps not living up to, the stated vision and mission. What we can do is say, well, how do we build with like-minded people, right? So that we don't become consumed with what is going wrong, right?
But
And
that's
so,
why you leave them alone, because you have a whole notebook full of stories where
yes,
people, young people, especially your age, and I'm calling you young,
thank
smile.
you so much.
Um, I know. Um, have tried. They've
Mhm.
tried to go back, they've tried to do this, and it ends in frustration.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we had was the third spaces,
Yes.
right? And those third spaces are still striving.
Hmm.
You know, I when I lived in Chicago, my living room was one of them.
Hmm.
And I, sat in the kitchen and listened. Oh, come on. No, 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 no. You only get old stuff from me. Let me hear what you have to say.
Hmm.
And I learned a great deal. I learned, and this was before the pandemic, of course, and I learned how they were thinking about both history,
Hmm.
mission and vision,
Yeah.
etc. And quickly coming to the conclusion we've bumped our heads far too many times.
Mm.
And it's such a drain on our souls
Hmm.
that we need to do something different.
Well, you know what I would say though, that even in third spaces, there's going to be conflict, right?
Always.
So the question for me is like, how are we prepared to repair conflict when it inevitably occurs? And what is the concerted effort that's being made to bridge some of the misunderstanding, the miscommunication, right? The divide between younger and elder. Because you need both in a community,
See,
right?
that's why I wanted everybody, and I should have been the spokesperson for Freedom Dreams. It was a perfect venue for that young and old conversation,
Hmm.
because older folk, many of them, when you think about it, just think about it, many of them don't have anything else to do
Hmm.
and are scared to turn the haven't nurtured anybody
Right.
to turn the reins over to,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because you're going to outdo me, and who would not want their children to outdo them? My God.
Well, I think that speaks to, and this is why I do encourage younger people to think about the fears of the elders, right?
Mhm.
Of being irrelevant, of being discarded, of being diminished, right? And the contributions and the sort of pioneering work that elders have done being forgotten or just seeing as not having as much value, right?
Right.
And so I think there's also defensiveness around ingratitude or what is felt to be ingratitude, and lack of empathy and understanding, right? When I think about what it meant for my mother to become a Muslim in 1977, right, and to change her name and her style of dress, and like this was huge, right? And
Yeah.
and I don't think that perhaps my generation or younger might take for granted, right? Certain even abilities, right? Like you still might be discriminated against because you're wearing a scarf, right?
Mhm.
But back then, to make a decision to completely change one's way of life. This wasn't just, oh, I'm a Muslim, right? You're completely changing your way of life. And you're doing so and still in the midst of, civil rights and black power and feminist movement. Like, so there was so much churning, right, in the waters during that time. So for someone like my mother to make a decision to become Muslim, the only Muslim in her family, well, my oldest uncle was Muslim as well, but to 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 really kind of go against the grain in this
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
right? Was I think the depth of the courage that it took is not well understood,
Well,
right?
it may be that the folk who went through it don't understand it either. They can
And
tell you about it when cornered, but prefer
Right.
to let it ride. But there's also one member of our class spoke about, well, we're all individuals now. We're on social media,
Mhm.
but my kids don't play with other Muslim kids.
Right.
I go to Juma and I come back home to my family.
Mhm. Mhm.
Muslim men don't have. I asked my husband about this. I said, why don't y'all have a football club or a basketball club or a skating club or a bowling club?
Mhm.
And I remember when women used to have all of those clubs, plus some, not
Mhm.
particularly those sports, but Muslim women don't do that either
Right.
anymore.
Right.
Everything is a special thing, but also the elderly in the communities across the board are not well taken care of.
That is true.
They're left to live and die alone,
Mhm.
some by starvation. One man I know by himself was eaten by his dog
Oh my.
um,
Wow.
in Philadelphia.
Oh, no.
But people are just left.
Well, but then
And somebody will say, "Oh, don't you remember Sister so
yeah.
and so? Well, she died."
Mm. But see, I think again that speaks to how critical the role of community is,
Mhm.
right? And so
Healthy
while
community.
healthy community,
Uh-huh.
um, and this in a community again in which everyone is assumed to have value, right? That is children, middle, elder, um, then how the transfer of that knowledge and that wisdom and that experience, right, from elder to younger is what allows continuity for the community.
Exactly.
So when that is a value and a virtue,
Mhm.
then elders are not left alone, right? Like you are our treasure. Why would we leave our treasure alone? Right? You know things that we haven't experienced. You have history, you have wisdom, and we need that. And so
But also, the elders need to be kept up to speed, and
yes.
that's what I appreciated about Freedom Dreams. As an intensive, and I'm listening to these young men, and I'm saying, "Oh my God, you were born what year?" You don't get that you need
1989.
in your conversation. Oh my goodness, you know.
Yes.
But I think, are you going to do that intensive again?
I think we should. I think we
Yeah,
should.
I'm wondering if you should start from scratch because I really don't care about the rest of the people. But I want number 11 through 20.
W well
No.
well, you know what? I so here's what I would ask you.
Hmm.
What if you could sort of identify what did you find most compelling about the space that would make you wanna return? Because we also formed a community,
We did.
right? I mean, we disagreed, there were some tense moments, there were some, but we
I got a
committed.
picture and I found it compelling.
But But what we learned how to do was to sit with
Yeah,
each other,
yeah.
right? And to take the time to say, "Well, before I can even refute what you're saying, I have to understand it."
And
Right?
which
Where are you coming from and how are we in agreement? How are we going to just differ from one another because we're different people? But I'm curious to know because this is sort of what we also want to repeat is a sense of commitment to being in relationship with people and not simply when it's easy, right? Not when we're all getting along, but how are we when there's conflict, right? Because that's what a healthy community knows how to do, right? Just to say we're inevitably we're going to bump heads, right? We're people, but we have a commitment to this vision of who we want to be, and that also serves as kind of the guardrails, right? So we don't kind of go off the deep end.
I think the thing practically I found most compelling was the fact that you were watching your screen. You knew who was raising their hands.
Oh.
For the most no, that's important
Mhm.
because some people get so into reading their PowerPoints that they haven't paid any attention to their audience.
Mm.
Who's sleeping, who's, oh my God, what is she talking about? Or any of those things. I think for the most part, the slides had a minimum of information and then you're talking. One
Mm.
of the problems often with Zoom is people write their whole lecture on slides
Right.
and then they read them to you.
Nobody
So
likes it.
this worked a little differently and it was engaging.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah, and that there was plenty of time, I think a couple of times, maybe more than a couple, we went overtime, we were so into it,
Mhm.
and your family was saying, like, "Mom, are you ever gonna get off that computer?"
Right.
Um, but it was engaging. I mean, really, really engaging, and I would implore you to, think about doing it again and for the invite back those who have taken it because now that they've digested and they can
Mm.
go back and see themselves in the videos that were produced, I think that they would have a lot to say. But I'm
Mm.
just shocked. I thought the class was going to be huge and that I was late because I forgot. And then I'm rushing, and then I forgot about Tuesday. But once I locked into Tuesday, I was locked in.
Well, you know what so I didn't anticipate that it would be a large group, right? And I prefer like more, smaller and intimate, but this is also, I mean, at least I felt that there were some conversations in which people really felt heavy, right? And not heavy in terms of like a burden, but that there's an awareness,
Yeah.
right? There's a process of reflection that also is required when you're thinking about intentional community, which means that you have to think about yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like are you a healthy contributing member to a community, or are you the person that causes causes conflict, causes strife? Well,
Me.
no, that wasn't you.
But I
But
think that is important because one of the things that happened in that community was we had one participant who just didn't get some things,
mhm.
and the community was uncompromisingly patient,
Yes,
and they didn't have to be.
right.
They could have called him out, they could have done all kinds of things, but they purposefully chose not to.
Yeah.
And then we had some revelations, so to speak. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, I've always felt not respected, not considered, not
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know uh, a part of, or not even being valued for my expertise, which it took
Right.
me a while to get. And that was listened to and
Mhm.
heartfelt by both the men and the women
Yes.
there. So
Yes.
those are all the things I loved, which
Yeah.
means you should do it again.
I hear you loud and clear.
I know it's hard. 10 weeks,
Yeah.
is
But
a
I
lot.
think these so for me, my prayer is that these are the seeds that will help others. Then, if you share the information that you've gained with other people, right? And whatever way you understood it, then that means more people are talking about no, community includes how we belong, how we matter, how we feel valued,
Mhm,
and how we begin to think about healing in the process of being in relationship with one another in a very purposeful way, right? And seeing the worth of each individual member, right? And so when you say that there are folks who were uncompromisingly sort of patient, it is because we
mhm.
felt that there was value to everyone in the room.
But see, that was, I'm sure, your goal in an intentional community building exercise. And
Mhm.
I'm gonna ask you this as a parting shot. God
Uh-oh.
willing, and I'll catch up with you again. Um, Dr. Kameelah Rashad is
Yes, ma'am.
one person. Are you
Yes.
gonna let him burn you out? Can you lecture everywhere
No, I
and do
cannot.
all the wonderful things that you do?
Mhm.
How are we gonna keep you healthy?
I would say in 2 ways really quickly. Um, Ensuring that there is sufficient resource, right, for even the sort of the production of knowledge, and that again speaks to value and worth. And so in knowing how, um labor intensive, right? This process can be, right, of getting people to to feel connected and to feel valued and to feel seen, um, do we devote sufficient resources, financial resources, right, to making sure that happens? And for me, it's also, how do we kind of train up a cohort of people, right, who are able to speak to these concepts and then able to um, uh, invite others in to the conversation, right? So that we build a critical mass, we build momentum around this way of thinking, right? Around Black Muslim psychology, Black Muslim freedom dreams, that we really want to consider this question of, who are we in 2041? In the next 2 decades, who are we? What are we doing? Right? Are we better now, in the future than we are now? What have we built and sustained? And so for me, the question is, do we literally put our money where our mouth is? Right? We say that this is something that we need to continue. How do we allocate the resources in order to get it done? And then how do we build the relationships that'll be necessary to sustain it? Oh, now I think you're on mute. I can't hear you.
I will be better when I have my second intensive.
Okay. I look, it's heard loud and clear.
Okay. However it is I can help you pull that off, just call on me.
I
And
certainly
I want to
will.
thank you from the bottom of my heart. This has been such a wonderful, quick 56 minutes.
Yes, it has.
And I'm
Alhamdulillah.
telling you. So this is Dr. Aminah Al-Deen for Critical Talk. I have had a wonderful, but always too short time with
I know.
Dr. Kameelah Rashad, who still owes me a cake, but she'll get over it. I won't. And I will see you all next time. Salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Stay on.